afternoon to you all. Welcome to the afternoon session of this conference. Today's paper presentation session begins now, and we have 5 sessions. The first session is chaired by Dr. Anupama Ora. She works as an English professor in DTE University of Jammu. She has been invited far and wide the world to deliver lectures. She has stamped her intellectual presence in many national and international conferences. She has delivered more than 100 lectures in orientation and refresher course in HRCCs across the country. She is a nominated national resource person for master's training in and adult. She has to take over the session, ma'am.
I just want to know whether I'm audible or not.
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you. You can begin
Yeah,
the session, ma'am.
that's fine. So we have around 4 presentations in this section, and you'll excuse me for wearing the mask because I'm sitting in my office. And congratulations to the organizers for organizing this conference on the virtual platform and bringing us all together from east, west, north, and south. And the first presentation we have by Dr. Chandrasekhan Parveen, and
Yes,
he
ma'am.
is
Yes,
with
ma'am.
us. The paper presenters that will have a paper presentation for 10 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of question answer session. Is it okay with all the presenters?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, no problem.
So it's for Dr. Chandrasekhan, who will be making a presentation on the tribal empowerment issues, English language for tribal empowerment issues in pedagogy. A very relevant theme in the present context, and I'm looking forward to hear from you because we also have the tribals in Jammu and Kashmir, and we are also planning how to reach out to them in context of education.
Can you see my screen, ma'am? Hello. Can you see
Yeah.
it? Fine. Good afternoon, respected chair. I let the participants. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present the paper. My topic is from the topic area Teaching and Learning for Empowerment. The title, as you can see, is English Language for Tribal Empowerment. Now, I'm a retired principal of a teacher training college, and as part of my own profession, I'm expected to look at the kind of language and the texts that are being used, and this is based on a study which I've conducted. So I'm proceeding. So I'll begin by telling you something about the background of the study. Am I audible? Hello? Hello,
Yes,
am I
yes,
audible?
sir. Yes,
Yes.
sir.
The background to the study, I'll tell you something about the rationale for the study, the research questions, the methodology, the population sample procedure, and findings. As you all know, as per the 2001 census, 8% of tribals, of the population is tribals in India. you can see, you just look at this visual, there are tribes with different kinds of developmental stages. You can see look at the picture, the third picture, one man who is wearing a shirt as though he is like a non-tribal. Look at the girl below, one has disheveled hair, the second row, here the disheveled hair, and the other person probably she has been in contact with non-tribals and she's dressed almost like a non-tribal. So it varies. In fact, in one of our own presentations, the keynote speaker, Vasuki, said that tribals have their own oral culture and history, and we have to tradition. So it's so important for us. Now, but there are tribals who refuse to come into contact with the non-tribals and lead a separate life. But we have the tribal integrated tribal development projects, which sees to it that the basic development that tribes in India deserve is looked into. So this is one part of the background. Then, you know, this is a study related to education. In 1986, in the National Education Policy, it specified that we have to produce instructional materials for tribal school children. Now, in 1998, the second language acquisition program was introduced in Kerala state. It was then a new revised curriculum came up. And this second language acquisition program drew heavily from Noam Chomsky's work. Now, a study conducted in 2012 found that learners have adjustment problems with the school curriculum, even the way in which English is taught. So this is the background to my study. And why I'm really interested in studying is because since 2000, several schemes were set up by the government of India for improvement of the tribal economy and the tribal education. As you can see, for education, it was pre-metric scholarship, top scholarship, national overseas scholarships, all these were introduced. And you know, that was also the time when the mobile phone was slowly entering. You know, it is a revolution because, you know, even the tribals started getting mobile phones. That means remote villages away from remote tribal hamlets were now becoming accessible. Now, then what happened? The tribal youths who were getting connected with the non-tribals began to realize that English is a language of empowerment. So but you know, there's one big problem. English language has a cultural baggage. Tribes have their own culture. So how was English taught? I kept wondering. This is what prompted me to undertake the study. So these are my research questions. Did tribal school teachers employ strategies to foster communication in English? Were English learning materials context specific? And were the teachers adept at transacting the curriculum in the tribal setting? These are three questions I mentioned. I've mentioned more in my paper, but because of time constraint, I'm just focusing on these three. So this is what, with these questions when the study commenced, you know. And how did I do? Traditional empirical study of documents, then interviews with teachers and tribals. I had visited them. Data collected through observation and was then corroborated with the findings I saw in the documents and the studies. Now, some which I found was these. The NCERT, they themselves conducted a study. And then they found that the listening, speaking, reading, writing, the main important language skills, there was no integration with other subjects also. In fact, I met a few teachers who were called by RIE Mysore to develop materials because they found that the material being used was unsuitable. It happened in RIE Mysore. I engaged myself in the workshop. Another thing is that the tribal language is essentially different from English. And there is little scope for interaction. We all know that it is through interaction that you learn. Tribals and use English, and this affected the acquisition of English. Now, what is important about the second language acquisition program being introduced in Kerala? Peer interaction was important. But then learners have to interact, only then language learning happens. Now, these children were not interested in using English, though the teachers did try their best, but this was not happening. It means language learning was not happening. These are visuals which tell you there are single teacher schools, there are teachers who are, this is how they sit and they learn. But then what is important, you go to grade 8, studies have found there are students who are unable to read and write. Look at the school structure. This is not the suitable, the formal school structure is not suitable for first generation learners, or even learners who come from first generation families where the parents are not educated. They go back home, there's no one to help them out. Relatives don't know. And teachers, of course, textbooks have their own learning outcome. But then, a teacher teaching in the tribal area has to match it with the learner needs. What is the purpose of which he is going to learn English? And then this was never done. And more importantly, qualified teachers who know the tribal culture and who could adapt and teach them accordingly were missing. Any teacher who gets posted in the tribal area will immediately take leave, come back. So education was not happening properly. So, but there are certain limitations to my study. I've relied heavily on secondary data. And so it's very difficult. As you all know, during the COVID season, there was travel restriction. I couldn't go there and collect. So some data had to be collected through telephone and so on, but I cannot fully generalize on it. But then there are further studies can be done. We all have seen during the COVID season, ICT was being explored for teaching. And not only that, because the smartphone is available, now it is possible to teach using the smartphone also. So this is a possibility. So now I would like to conclude by stating the State of the World's Indigenous Peoples Education Report. Please read. It's a means of in a multi-dimensional and complex long-term process. It depends on the conditions of the region, country, and community. We have several tribes in India. If you want transformation to happen, it means good planning. It's complex. It is not easy. And we have to address this. Okay? These are select references. And so, thank you. I'm ready to ask questions. I'm stopping sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chandrasekhan. A very crisp, and within the time you made the things very clear to us, and it's something very interesting that the tribals who are not exposed to education, and then they have to learn English, and rightly pointed out by you, the cultural baggage. And then in my state also, when we conducted a study, the first question was, why do we learn it? They didn't realize, we say it's the language of empowerment, but for them, to convince them, and then the school dropout rate is so much that at the end of the day, they lose interest in studies also, and especially in case of girls. So now the floor is open for questions. One thing I would like to share with all my participants is, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are. You are.
The beauty of these conferences comes out when you ask questions. And for the young presenters, don't hesitate that, well, my question would be right, or whether I'll be able to justify my question. Please come out, whatever queries, whatever observations you have, please feel free to ask. Because these are the rare platforms which we get, and a paper which is on teaching of English language to the tribals for their empowerment raises many questions.
Hello, am I audible?
You are. Please.
Dr. Chandrasekhan, I will ask a question to Dr. Chandrasekhan, sir.
Sure,
Sir, you
sure.
said that in your small presentation, you said that you have drawn data from schools and teachers. I would like to know what were your conclusions, findings. What were your findings?
Whatever I mentioned of my findings, should I go back? Well, as you know, the language of the tribals are different. The language which you're trying to teach English, it has to be taught through interaction. That is the main thing. But, they are not interested. Learning a language means words, pronunciation, spelling, the ability to read, articulate, and interact. This was not happening. Standard 8 learners, they were incapable of reading and writing. So basic learning was not happening. Some kind of drill what the teachers used to do. That is certainly a repetitive process. And language is actually learned when you interact. And that means, somehow the strategy is not matching the needs of the learners. Unless the learner has a felt need, he is not going to learn. Our tribals have a different culture. In fact, that is exactly what the NCERT also found. I met the people who prepared the textbooks, and they were claiming that yes, it works, but the studies found it doesn't work. There was no integration between the 4 language skills and even the other subjects that were being taught. And they were finding English a big burden, They were not finding meaning, a point in learning. Unless you are motivated to learn a language, you cannot learn. So this motivation was lacking.
Sir, talking about myself, I teach in such area in one of the villages of Maharashtra, where I teach to the students from very backward areas, remote areas, and also few of them are from tribal communities. Sir, I would like to ask you a second question. What could be the best method of teaching English to the tribal students or to the students from backward areas, remote areas?
I'm happy you asked this question. There are tribes who come out to the non-tribal areas, study in hostels, and attend and interact with non-tribals. So, when they are with the group who is also speaking, the necessity makes them learn, So in snatches, they start learning. That is one thing. Imitation, repetition, teaching something to them to read, associating with words, spelling, and all that. It is a conscious process. They should be willing to learn. Now, what happens in the tribal class schools inside the tribal belts is that they come attend, they get the free food, they like to be there sometime, they like to play for some time, and if there's a call, they have to work in their home, they will rush back. Learning happens not only in the school, but even outside. They go back, they have to read, prepare homework, do that. This kind of thing is not happening. You look at it, make them do the initial reading association. That alone is not enough. It's a conscious work. Remember, if you want to read and write, you have to learn words, you have to learn spelling, you have to learn pronunciation, you have to construct sentences, then you have to teach them the graphic, then you have to start them writing. This is a continuous process, and it is unfortunately not happening. They learn in snatches because their objective is different. Their livelihood is important for them. And will English really help them survive in their own setting? No. But there are tribal children, as you say, who come to non-tribal areas, stay in schools, pre-metric hostels, they stay and interact with the others. This is almost a similar strategy that works in a normal government school can be tried.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response, sir.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Any more questions?
Yeah, one more question.
Please ask.
Yeah, congratulations, sir. It was a nice presentation.
Thank you.
My question to you is, don't you think that this language teaching, particularly English language teaching to the tribals, is a kind of imposition on them? And I also see it as a process of rooting them out from their own indigenous culture and learning environment. Your take on this?
So you have asked the crux of the issue, whether you should educate tribals in our pattern, our fashion, or ensure that what languages they have, make them literate in that and help them survive and live happily. Now, these are days, unfortunately, these are days where the internet, the smartphone, I've been to tribal villages, I was shocked to see they were living in concrete houses with cable TV facility. And what our assumption of tribals is that they live in huts away from it. But, they are getting constantly interacted with the regular society. And, the people who cheat them, they buy produce, sell it at a lower price. They still make the men drink liquor. and which means fleecing money out of them, creating problems in it. So sensitizing them to all these aspects, and for which basic knowledge of English is going to help them. You give them a false product and sell them. If the fellow knows to read and write in English, he knows I'm being cheated, because there are many who cheat the tribals and make their lives miserable. So the basic skills you have to teach them. Even if they want to integrate with our community, that is essential. But then they can also maintain their distance. I'm not asking you to completely transform them, but let them lead it. Now let us look at the COVID situation, for example. They should learn about health, about washing hands, how it is spread. If you just ignore them and you say, okay, it's your culture, if you don't want to mix, means you are not fulfilling your duty as a citizen. They are also part of our population. They are Indians. It is your duty to take care of them. They should know what is if it's a democratic setup in a country, you must teach them democratic principles. So there are so many things involved. And if you simply say, let us not, then they will be like the tribals in the Andamans who have never interacted with people outside. No, you live in a society where you're going to interact with people outside. So you must give them the basic, essential education, literacy, so that they can live happily, but not be exploited. Did I make myself clear, sir? Or did I confuse you?
Yeah. Still, I see some problem areas there. The thing is, I don't think that means English can really make them really free from their exploitation.
Yeah.
Exploitation happens in every part of society today, with every community. So that's a kind of setup that we live in. So English particularly, because since it's a foreign language for them, and it's a completely a different sort of thing for them. So in that different setup, their natural instincts, their natural learning potential is not explored fully. And English serves as a commercial or way of communication with other people. That's it. It has its own limitation.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to ask you another question. Think you are probably, which state are you from, Sam? What is your mother tongue? Sir, which state?
I am from Maharashtra, and my mother tongue is
Good.
Marathi.
Marathi. Let us imagine a Marathi medium classroom. Students learning English in a Marathi medium classroom and students learning English in an English medium classroom. Even the students in the Marathi medium can ask, why should I learn? I can survive with Marathi. Do you think that person will be successful? You ask yourself. How that person can be denied opportunities for social mobility, for getting better jobs, because he's going to live in a society, he's going to interact with people from non-tribals, So you deny them English, you're denying them higher education. Higher education is in English. So the primary level, okay. Do you want them to live as it is? If that they could have tribals who can become smart. You have seen sportsmen who excel, tribals, And there are other, in our own state, a person has become an IAS officer recently, a tribal, an IAS officer. There are tribals who write. We have just listened to tribal people. Even in this seminar, we have seen people who can write literary works. So if you teach them, they can. But I'm not asking you to complete it. Yeah, I'm against that concept, honestly. But then the basic education you have to give. And English is a global language, a language of empowerment.
One of the essential components it is, if we really want them to be empowered. Because English is not now confined only in the educational sector only. You watch the serials, you watch the media, it's more of a English, the words from English entering into our language. So how do we bring them at par with others if we deny them English? That's the larger question.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing, madam?
Yeah, sure.
You look at the three language formula. You think Hindi is spoken in South India, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka? Do you think Hindi is spoken? And what is the language you use for as a lingua franca? It is English. It is not Hindi. So English has a place, at least in South India. For the tribals in South India, English has a major it's a major language for them.
And let me, sir, share with you one more thing. We conducted a study, and in the survey, there was one question. And many of the young students whom we interviewed, they were the undergraduate students. They were going to these English learning institutions. So when we asked them why, that was just to have that sense of confidence to come out of the inferiority complex. They said at the end of the day, if we learn 10 words which are in common use every day, well, that gives them the confidence that they can converse in their own language.
Yes.
So that is the role which English plays. We cannot deny it. And English no more, I feel, is the language of the Europeans, or it comes from West. English now is our language. Look at our writers, the way they are writing. They are bringing that the Indian culture baggage into the English language. So no more it's a colonial language. Any more questions?
Hello.
Yes,
I'm completely agree with Dr. Chandrasekharan because if you want to bring the tribal community out of their predicament, if you want to bring them into the mainstream, you will have to provide them at least a basic education. And English is a window. English is like a window to the world and the progress. Unless and until you do not give them basic education, the exploitation of the tribals, they will be more exploited, I think, if you do not provide them basic education. And providing English education is a better way of making them more and more aware about their own predicament.
Yes.
Very, very nice presentation, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We move on to the second presentation by Madam Meena Sharma from Dibrugarh. Yes, Madam Meena Sharma, you will be presenting on voicing the marginalized.
Yes.
A reading of Philip Desai's The Inheritance of Law.
Yes. Am I audible? Yes. Am I audible, madam? Yes. Hello. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present a paper in this seminar. My topic is basically related to the novel Kiran Desai's Inheritance of Loss, in which I wish to draw the attention towards the Gorkha community that is depicted in the novel and the crisis in identity that these people faced in the larger context of the Indian nation and basically in the Northeast. So the question of Gorkha or Nepali identity in India, which spans for more than 200 years, is in a state of continuing crisis. And against this backdrop, this paper examines the portrayal of Indian Nepalese or Gorkhas in the novel Inheritance of Loss by the diasporic Indian writer Kiran Desai. The Inheritance of Loss is set in the northeastern state of Kalimpong, India in the 1980s. I have chosen this novel basically because it is one of the mainstream novels, if we may so call it, which depicts this particular community, and also what has drawn my attention is the crisis that this community faces, and basically, how voicing the marginalized becomes a problem. When there is dearth of academic research surrounding the problems of this particular community. So it may be pertinent here to give a brief description of the Gorkha community. There are millions of Gorkhas in India today, and of course a sizable population live in Darjeeling and the northeastern parts of the country. The word Gorkha, of course, comes from a small principality in Nepal, which I wouldn't go on to, but the names Gorkha and Nepali are used interchangeably in India, although political movements at different times have favored the use of the word Gorkha over Nepali. in order to differentiate between the citizens of Nepal and India. To provide a history of the Gorkhaland is not within the scope of my paper, but I would like to mention a few books like Barun Roy's Gorkha and Gorkhaland, where he tries to talk about the ethnicity of Nepali-speaking people, popularly known as Gorkhas in India. He traces their struggle for recognition in the Darjeeling Hill, where their demand for a separate state Gorkhaland continues till today. And Roy defines the term as a broad-based ethnic classification. Now, while providing a socio-political study of the Gorkhas and their demand for a separate state Gorkhaland, Roy points out that the issue of the Gorkhas has not been touched upon by many scholars, and there are very few books dwelling on the anthropological study of the Gorkha people. And he further says that lack of authoritative work of the Gorkha as a people is such that one wonders whether the millions of Gorkhas in India are invisible to the eyes of scholars, authors, and researchers alike. And the problem of Gorkha identity, therefore, has remained an under-researched terrain. And the handful of study that is available tend to be very, very stereotypical depiction of the Gorkha as a martial race, as a brave race. And of course, this also has a lot to do with the colonial discourse when the Britishers recruited them into the army. Now, in this regard, the novel Inheritance of Loss uses the Gorkhaland movement as a catalyst, which is commendable, given the fact that no other novel of international fame has actually mainstream, basically, has talked about this movement. It is set in mid-1980s, and it talks about the people, culture, and ongoing Gorkhaland movement in Kalimpong. Now, regarding the position of Gorkha community in Darjeeling, another scholar, Michael Hutt, points out that as emigre workers, the Nepalis of Northeast India have suffered a high degree of exploitation. And in the main industries of Darjeeling district, Nepalis constitute a vast majority of workforce, but are almost wholly absent from ownership or management of any concern. But of course, the situations are changing. Now, the main intention of the Gorkhaland movement was the empowerment of the marginalized communities by demanding more access to state institutions and resources. The novel at times manages to depict this truth, as can be seen when the agitators gather and shout against the exploitation. And I quote from the novel, "Have we been rewarded? Have we been given compensation? Are we given respect? No, they spit on us. In our own country, the country we fight for, we are treated like slaves." However, throughout the novel, the genuineness of the movement is undermined, and it is depicted as a threat to cross-cultural harmony of the state. Now, the movement, the novel actually gives a description, I would cut it short, as a description of the movement, how it is initiated by student agitators, and more, the focus more is on insurgency, because the word insurgency is used in the novel, and they shout Gorkhaland for Gorkhas. We are the Liberation Army. Quite suddenly, everyone was using the word insurgency. And once the movement is triggered, there is, of course, widespread discontent, horrors increase, road blockade increase, tourists stop coming to the hills. And this description is very much evident and seen in the novel. Now, it may be noted in this context that studies conducted on the Gorkhaland movement emphasize the economic aspects surrounding the movement, or look at it as a case of separatism. And the colonial construction of the Gorkha identity and its crisis later has been a lesser researched area, which perhaps also accounts for the problem that is associated with voicing this community and the movement that they were fighting for. The uprising that is there definitely affects the entire fabric of the novel, and nevertheless, at times the novel gives us an insight into the general opinion regarding the movement. And from the beginning, the Gorkha community is represented very stereotypically as robbers, intruders, and the first chapter itself also shows them with weapons and foods, robbing into Judge Lola's house. There are very statements like a character in the novel, Lola says, "What if these hooligans come to Mon Ami? They are bound to come. We have nothing, nor they will deter. They'll kill for 50 rupees. And then there is a sense of distrust surrounding around, again, this community. But you have a watchman, said Sai, and Buddhu but he's a Nepali. Who can trust them now? It is always the watchman in a case of a robbery. So suspicion and mistrust for the community is voiced several times in the play. Similarly, the stereotypical depiction of the Nepalis or the Gorkhas as servants, idiots, watchmen, and coolies is quite common. And there are again instances in the novel when one, of course, is educated Sai, and a cook asks, "It is strange that the tutor is Nepali. Nepalis make good soldiers and coolies, but they are not so bright at their studies." Noni, however, feels that the point of view of the Nepalese should also be taken into account. These are certain ways I'm pointing out at the stereotypical way in which this community is depicted, and it is a very, very one-sided kind of a representation of this community. So far as the Neps were thrown out of Assam and then out of Meghalaya, obviously the Nepalis are worried. They have been here, most of them, several generations. Why shouldn't Nepali be taught in schools? But Lola believes that this would only lead to more separatist movement, insurgency, and rebellion. So Lola also boasts of her egoistic sense of a superior Indian citizen, and she views the Indian Nepalis as outsiders, dismissing their cause for struggle as nothing other than a case of illegal migration. It's an issue of a porous border. What? You can't tell one from the other. Indian Nepali from Nepali Nepali. Now, these are questions which have, of course, been taken up by scholars who try to talk about a distinct identity regarding the Gorkhas in India. Later in the novel, again, she voices a common prejudice. Gorkhas are mercenaries. That is what they are. Pay them and they are loyal to whatever. Similar views also come from other newspaper agents. Nepalis making trouble. They should kick the bastards back to Nepal. Why are they sitting in our country? So as the people start discussing the movement, different opinions are generated, and that again hints at the lack of understanding that is there regarding the problems surrounding this particular community. Now, of course, the GNLF readers again are portrayed as people who take an opportunity to succumb power. Although the novel substantially draws on the theme of Gorkha's local struggle for corporate identity in the modernizing space of India in the mid-1980s, the novel fails in making a truthful representation of the Gorkhaland movement. It is depicted as an ethnic insurgency encouraged by Nepalis from across the Nepal-India border for larger interest. The root cause of the Gorkhaland movement and the socio-historical, political and cultural realities behind the movement do not find any reflection in the novel. It cannot be denied that subnational insurgencies have, of course, wreaked havoc in different parts of India for many decades, but Desai's novel, in fact, tries to speak from this particular politically advantageous point of view, and it condemns the excesses of the Gorkhaland insurgency that swept Darjeeling and Kalimpong hills in 1980s, but the novel's criticism of Gorkhaland insurgency is fraught with difficulties. Historically, this movement was not about throwing non-Nepali residents out of the hills, in spite of its adoption of violent tactics that the novel justly criticizes. Instead, its agenda included self-government of the marginalized community by demanding access to state institutions and resources. It seems that while the novel does acknowledge some of these inconvenient truths, the movement is broadly seen as a threat to cross-cultural harmony on the one hand and the unity of the Indian nation state on the other. And this depiction, of course, raised a lot of outrage among readers, and there were immediate reactions from the public. They complained that the book unfairly portrays them as petty criminals and stupids. And there was one scholar, Professor P.B. Giri, he says that while emphasizing the violent means adopted by the insurgents to meet their demands, the novel downplays the felt need of self-empowerment of a marginalized community. Similarly, Shroff wrote, describing a country landscape is one thing, but creeping into the skins of the characters is another. The Gorkha characters remain shallow caricatures, just like in a Bollywood film. So the novel uses negative stereotypes to describe this community, and a clear distinction is made between the mainstream Indian and the subaltern Nepali. Now, the problematic, therefore, of voicing the marginalized, suppressed and inferior other is clearly evident in the novel. The life world of the Gorkha in India occupy a peripheral location and has been an under-researched terrain when we talk about mainstream academia. And in fact, the Gorkhas in India India, literally and figuratively, located on the margin, especially the northeastern states where there is a sizable population, and have received very little attention from mainstream academia. Although there are works on identity formation of the Gurkha, there is still dearth of research on the contribution of social and cultural movement in Darjeeling and elsewhere towards the formation of a distinct Gurkha identity. The cultural identity of the Gurkhas, therefore, has failed to gain a political space, which also accounts perhaps for deep fissures in the representation of this community, as can be seen in this particular novel, which I just take as an instance of how the Gurkhas have been depicted, the stereotypical attitude by which it has been depicted, and at the same time the problem that is there in voicing the marginalized, and the debate of the center and periphery that definitely comes into the fore when we look at their identity formation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Meena, for a very insightful presentation and raising the issue of the Gorkha identity and the mistrust or other things that they are there for the lower jobs surrounding their work, etc. And now it's open for questions. So observations, questions, queries are most welcome. Yes, participants can put forth their questions. Yes, once again, I request the participants to please put forth their questions or queries or any observations or with any other text they want to relate this work or with some other movement. Because what we have observed in our country is that 80s onwards, the question of identity has become free. And now we find that it's not a question of identity here only, but all over the world, the identity remains supreme. And this is what the writers also in the creative work are looking up. Thank you, ma'am. It was a wonderful presentation from your side. I think you made things so clear that there is no scope left for the question. At the end, someone will come up. Thank you so much, Meena, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Ramni Swarna, who is from the School of Philosophy, Delhi University. Welcome, ma'am. And ma'am will be discussing on the systematic literature review for ecological reviews and comparison with the ecological concerns in Kalidasa's Raghuvansham. Over to you, ma'am, now.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity. Good afternoon, Chairperson, ma'am. I hope I'm audible to all of you. And I thank to the organizers and thanks all the co-presenters with me as well as the participants also. As ma'am has already mentioned, the title that I'm taking care right now today, it's basically more of a, I would say, a systematic literature review, because due to the post-COVID times, I was able to observe quite a lot of things, and I wanted to really understand what is the contribution of the academia towards the entire ecological concerns that we are going through at the moment. The flow of the paper would be abstract, introduction, purpose, research questions, methodology, findings, implications, conclusions, references, and the acknowledgements. The keywords that I had chosen for my study are ecological concerns, Raghuvamsham, which is the popular book that we can find in the Sanskrit literature. Kalidasa is the author of that particular work, systematic literature review, and the comparison between the systematic literature review. Okay, now what I mean by systematic literature review is that I had to scan through the various databases and come up with the papers, the collection of the papers with help of the keywords that I have already shared with each one of you, and find out, what exactly the research that is being taken care in the domain of the academics. And this is a multidisciplinary approach. And thanks to the some of my friends and colleagues who also helped me to understand what kind of a questions should I take it up so that I can proceed further. So the main purpose of my study is to conduct the systematic literature review, and whatever I was able to find out that, compare it with Kalidasa's Raghuvamsham, especially from the perspective of the ecological concerns. Now, these are my main research questions. Number one, can we see some of the ecological concerns in the prior research papers and in Raghuvamsham itself? Now, what are the reasons for them? How are the ecological concerns tackled, reasoned out in both kinds of literatures? Now, that is where my findings came up more with. Now, what are the different lessons that we can understand and see? And is there any scope for the future research also? That is what I wanted to find out. And luckily, through the this particular, I would say, literature review, I was able to come up with a new theoretical framework which can be drawn for the future time, especially with reference to the ecological concerns for me. Now, this is the research methodology which was taken care of in three different phases for me. Number one, the planning area, wherein I have to, as I said, scan through the important databases from Google Scholar as well as Web of Sciences in order to understand how much of research has been done in terms of qualitative as well as the quantitative, or maybe in terms of the literature reviews also. In phase two, I had to focus upon my review form of the research questions that were drawn upon, and my focus was exclusively only on those research questions itself. In phase three, as I said, my strategy was to start off with the databases, then drill down to specific number of papers that I had to focus upon, and then carry forward to understand as to what are the ecological concerns and how to carry forward. Now, this has been taken care from the Web of Science, and you can see that why I said it's a multidisciplinary approach. Now, when I started, I should say, searching with the keyword ecological concerns, environmental sciences gave me these many, that is, you can see out here, this is 7,343 papers: ecology, environmental studies, biodiversity, conservation, engineering. Now, this was at the initial level. Later on, I wanted to grill down myself to the literature itself and see, apart from these domains that are there, what is the contribution of the literary studies also side by side. So here I was able to find out that yes, I can grill down myself, analyze it, and come up with specific number, and that number is 1,940 papers. And you can see how many of them were cited, and what is the average per item also in terms of the H index that we have got. Now, this is the scope of my research. We can see that in 2021, if you look at it, I can showcase to you that the kind of the research, especially on ecological concerns, has been a drip in 2021. Now, the cause is that we have got a lot of scope, and one can really proceed further in order to understand the specific problem and contribute more. And that is the importance of my own research work on the specified and identified topic for myself. Now, these are the findings which I could do. Main concerns seen in English literature in various papers. I could see that in terms of duplicacy, then copied ones, or you can say especially written in different languages. I had to exclude all of them. And the moment I included only the specific, I was able to find out that yes, nature, differences in Anthropocene and Biosense, nature versus culture, sustainable development, environmental justice, eco-criticism via the interdisciplinary approach, and species loss, pollution, global warming, toxicity, deforestation. These were the only things that I was able to identify. However, the moment I jumped into Raghuvamsham and looked at the kind of the reviews which were available, I could see that there are more than these concerns, and the way they had identified and discussed in particular different verses as well as the chantos. Chantos are the different chapters of the Raghuvamsham, and you can see that the number of the concerns and the way they were discussing, I was amazed. Raghuvamsham, which was written, I should say, in the past, as compared to the reviews that I had taken up, there were a lot of differences, and that is the importance why I thought this is the specific time for me to go ahead and contribute my own research work so that I can continue afterwards also side by side. Now, these are some of the theorists, I would say, from the eco-criticism side, and there were a lot of them. My favorite ones are definitely Caroline Merchant, Val Plumwood, then Karen, Vandana Shiva. And once I started looking at it, I came to know that yes, there has to be this kind of a new theoretical model which has to incorporate human beings on one side, sensitivity towards the ecological environment itself, awareness, consciousness. And this is initially because I thought that there should be some kind of a differentiation, or these two have been taken up as identical, awareness and consciousness. However, the moment I started reading the papers, I saw that yes, there is a clear cut demarcation between awareness and consciousness. Then the caring attitudes. Apart from that, we have got the ecofeministic values and the natural ecological habitat, now which turns out to be the cultural things that we need to understand and focus upon. So the conclusion is that concerns are more towards the caring attitude. Now, some of us are really caring, however, in post-COVID time, I find that entire community is now working towards in adopting the ecofeministic values like caring, empathy, sympathy, benevolence, and going ahead and taking care of the other parts of our environment also. Concerns for the natural habitats, rights and duties, being conscious about one's own activity, sensitivity, and awareness. Raghuvamsham clearly mentions even the king, when he is traveling in the chariot, does not forget, and he takes that kind of a stance wherein he says that my chariot should not be the cause of disturbing the other creatures as well as the trees. And he takes up that much of care not even to raise the dust which keeps on flying, when the chariot is carrying forward. Now, do we really take care of these small things in the present scenario is what I'm looking forward. Involvement of human beings with the ecofeministic values. These are the two implications which I could find it out, that it is not just the environment, even at the places of where we are working, professionalism, these values have to be adopted, and one needs to be really adhering to the certain variables that I have selected in my own model. Theoretical implication is that the new model that I had showcased through the multidisciplinary study needs to be incorporated for the future studies also. These are the limitations because my work focused exclusively on the systematic literature review rather than a qualitative research or a quantitative. So now I have got the scope from here to enter into meta-analysis, go forward with the meta-SEM, and enter into the quantitative research where I can come up with my own SEM model and flourish with the research further on. These are some of the references work that I have to pick it up and focus upon in my discipline. So I thank all my teachers and mentors, organizers, and chairperson ma'am also. Thank you, all of you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful presentation on a very new topic on which you have done an in-depth study and a very impressive one. And especially, I'm too impressed with the implication parts where you talked about the managerial ones, where we need to adopt and adapt these things in workplaces also. All
you,
the
ma'am.
best for your future research also, and maybe we get an opportunity to listen to you again also when
Yes,
you
thank
take
you,
up
ma'am.
this work. But I am telling you from the core of my heart, I'm really impressed. It's
Thank you,
something
ma'am.
new for me, and how you have made a comparative study looking at the web sources and all, how it is, this word environment ecology, how it is being used in the modern times, and how earlier in Kalidasa's Raghuvansham, and see the difference and the caring attitude and everything that really serves the message for all of us.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now, the presenters are most welcome to put forth their questions, queries, observations, whatever uh, they want to share with the paper presenter. Yeah, I know it's lunch time, but still we have 15-20 minutes more to go, and we have one more presentation. So one or two questions, because it's an entirely new area of research, you can put forth. Yeah,
Can I
Professor
ask a
Chandrasekhar.
question, ma'am?
Yeah, sure.
I must appreciate Ramani madam for taking up a topic, a new topic, and illustrating it fairly well. And I must also confess, I've heard so much about eco-criticism, but you have demonstrated the possibilities very well. Congratulations, madam.
Thank you, sir.
Just one question. You did mention about interdisciplinary study. Will
Yes,
you
sir.
cite one example of how literature has a separate discipline and Raghuvansham, we can see the proper literature? And what is the disciplinary? Can you just tell me how that interdisciplinary works with
Yes,
one
sir.
simple example?
Yes, sir. Thing is that, sir, it's all started off with my observation. I myself was a patient of COVID, and during that time, I was able to see the role the ladies picked up immediately serving the COVID meals. We all know that, right? Now, the idea started off with the temple food. Now, ISKCON is one of the places I have seen started up, and along with that, some gurudwaras, the area where I live in Delhi, sir. So, I understood the importance of the temple food because they were giving it absolutely free. And throughout the country, I could see, and I literally have to understand, is there any paper that has been written on temple food? Now, slowly as I came up, I had to enter into Bhagavad Gita, Buddhism, and Jainism also. While I was checking out with the Buddhism, I came to know that South Korea also have temple food, sir, which is very good, and that is again a new area which has to be explored in India. Bhagavad Gita very clearly tells you that yes, in the times of the crisis, if you have to be an action-oriented leadership. Now, action-oriented leadership comes from management, business studies, sir. Okay, that leadership quality and everything. Now you see, Bhagavad Gita again is a part of our literature. Now, similarly, as I was going through, I had to explore, and that was beyond the scope of this particular paper for this particular conference, I should say. In the other conferences, I had to highlight it and showcase it through Buddhist text, Jainism text, and Bhagavad Gita. Luckily, I've called because I should say, an earnest reader. Raghuvansham, was one thing that was very close to my heart. When I picked up, I wanted to see. Ashram also in those times had this rule that anybody who is suffering from something, they can come to the ashram, and food in terms of fruits, raw vegetables, leaves are given to them so that they can cure themselves maybe, or secondly you can say that they can fulfill their stomach and they are getting the blessings and everything. Slowly when I started reading the chantos means the chapters in Raghuvansham, this is the place wherein one of the ancestors of Lord Rama, he goes to the ashram to get the blessing from the sage. There, when he's moving in the chariot along with his wife who's pregnant, there, it very clearly mentions, the king takes it that, okay, I'm not supposed to disturb the birds. How many of us drive? Do we really take care of the birds when we are going across the roads? We don't, sir. These are the comparative work that I really wanted to see. Then he was very particular that, okay, the birds are there, maybe the ashram vasis who are going into the forest to collect the food and everything, the dust should not create a pollution. Now, that was a wonderful thing, sir. In cities where I live in, and I was brought up right from my childhood in Delhi, it is only near the hospital areas where you cannot honk, where you cannot disturb the hospital people. However, what about the rest of the areas? Now, these are also the things that we need to understand. Now, being a respiratory COVID patient, the doctors then they told me that yes, you have to take care of your lungs. I understood. Now, these are the subtle points, however, we are able to understand. Now, the moment they enter into the ashram, can be surprised to find that both carnivorous animals as well as the herbivorous animals are living together. And one more example which I really liked it is the children are being taught in the ashram. Apart from the theoretical knowledge, the practical knowledge was given to them as to how to plant a tree. If they are getting sampling, they cannot plant a tree in whatever way they want. First, they should remember the Lord, that the prayer that they are giving, respecting the environment. Secondly, the moment they have planted the tree, the nearby area has to be taken care of so that a small, I would say, area is created where water is stored. Now, there are two important things that they have highlighted here, and that was amazing. One, water for the plant. Number two, the animals who are living there, maybe in the form of you can say the land animals as well as the birds, they can drink this water. Now, we don't think in that manner, so when we are I should say planting the trees in our environment or taking care of it, whatever way, we just fulfill, we delegate our work and we are just going away. Now, this is where I learned from the eco critics, feminists like Vandana Shiva ma'am, or you can say my discussions with Karen Warren, and then even Wal Plumwood. When I was discussing, they said that Ramani, you are coming from the country where you are rich with literature, especially Sanskrit and Prakrit also. Now, if you look into those literatures, these kind of examples are given, which somehow we have forgotten in our daily lives right now. So that is why I said it has to be a comparative work between, I have just chosen for this particular international conference, Kalidasa's Raghuvamsham. Maybe in another conference, if the opportunity is given, I would like to pick up the Buddhist text or the Jain text also, and go ahead with that. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for illustrating. Thank you, madam.
Thank you, madam. And now we move on to the last presentation, which is by Dr. Vikas Meshram, and he will be speaking on neo-racist ambience of Germany and crisis of Black identity, a perspective on Paul Betty's Slumberland. Yes, Dr. Vikas.
Let me first of all make it clear to you, I'm not doctor. I'm still an assistant professor and pursuing, I'm pursuing my PhD. Still haven't completed it. So a little bit correction. Should I pin it here?
You will have this before your name, doctor.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Honorable Chairperson of this session, Vohra Madam, all the delegates who are present here and my friends. The topic of my today's presentation is neo-racist ambience of Germany and crisis of Black identity, a perspective on Paul Betty's Slumberland. Slumberland is the third novel of Paul Betty. Am I audible, ma'am? Yes. Hello. Hello.
Yes, you're
Am I
audible.
audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So I was saying that Slumberland is the third novel of Paul Betty. My present paper explores Paul Betty's portrayal of the still existing racial hatred and the rise of the neo-racist environment in Germany, which he has depicted in his novel The Slumberland. It purposefully explains the connotations of the several scenes and episodes in his novel, as I found relevance of them with the contemporary scenario in the Western world. It also deals with Paul Whitty's presentation of the predicament of the immigrant black population, the neo-Nazi and neo-racist ambience of Germany, and the racial conflicts that have exacerbated after the fall of Berlin Wall. So we all know that racism is not a new concept or is not a new term. It has been deliberated. It has been discussed in various times at various times. But though the concept of racism is not new to the world, the concept of neo-racism is quite novel, and it has not been discussed very much in the intellectual field. The term neo-racism was first used by Etienne Balibar, who called it as racism without race. Etienne Balibar has stressed the point that the basis of this new form of racism is cultural differences rather than biological ones. And he has defined it as forms of constructive or indirect racism, where such policies are implemented that limit, that prohibit, that reduce the rights of freedom of association, commercial activity, and freedom of intellectual and political and artistic expression of the targeted race or targeted people, population. Isabel Wilkerson is another writer who published her novel, her very innovative work in 2020, and she is also recipient of a Pulitzer Prize of America. She has given a very apt description of the nature of this novel form of contemporary racism, that is neo-racism. She relates, to us, the 20th century social scientists found new ways to measure what had transformed from the overt racism to a slow bale of antagonism that social scientists call unconscious bias. This was not the cross-burning, epithet-sewing biological racism of the pre-civil rights era, but rather discriminatory behaviors based on subconscious prejudgments by the people who professed and believed in inequality. She has also said that the modern day caste or race protocols are less often about overt attacks or conscious hostility and can be dispiritingly hand to fight. They are like the wind. The neo-racist attempts, you may say, they are like wind, powerful enough to knock you down, but invisible as they go about their work. As I said, Etienne Balibar was the first person to use this term neo-racism. And as far as neo-racism is concerned, it works not through direct discrimination, but through anti-black policies, stigmatization, stereotyping, racial jokes and humor, metonymic and synecdochic generalizations. And literature has not been blind to this change in the nature of racism. Of the recent novelist, the name of Paul Whitty can be taken to be the most successful novelist to deal with this problem of neo-racism in his novels. He has made his novel, this novel form of racism as a tool of his satire and crafted some of the most successful literary works. Many of you might be knowing that Paul Whitty had won Man Booker's Prize for his recent novel, The Sellout, which he published in 2015, and it received a Booker Prize in 2016. But we are concerned here with The Slumberland, his earlier novel, which deals with the crisis of black expatriates who immigrated to the divided by wall Germany, which was divided by the Berlin Wall into East Germany and West Germany, and the neo-racist and neo-Nazi ambience of German society. Through a story of a freelance musician, Ferguson Sowell. Now, Ferguson Sowell is the protagonist of this novel, The Slumberland, and he is a freelance musician, and he is popularly known as DJ Darky. So through this story of a freelance musician, he has brought out the conflicting relations of the Germans with the blacks and the rising Nazi powers and their racist ideology, which exacerbate the crisis of the black diaspora in Germany. The theme of the novel is one of the search of musical perfection, which the protagonist Ferguson Sowell sets out to find in the validation to his self-made musical beat by Charles Stone, who is popularly known as the Schwa, who lives in Berlin. And our protagonist Ferguson Sowell has to travel to Germany in search of the Schwa, so that he may validate his musical beat and make it more perfect. Because it is a general belief that he is the person, only Charles Stone, that is the Schwa, is the only person who can bring perfection to his music. This is all the outline of the story. But through this, Paul Vitti has touched upon the very core of German neo-racism. Here in this novel, Ferguson novel, the protagonist reminds us time and again that Negro is now officially human and the blackness is passé. Passé means the old, outdated. Blackness is passé. This is what he says. But he does so in a satiric vein, only to poke fun at the people who believe so, and to make us feel cheated with the forthcoming episodes in the novel. And regarding things, there is a critic, L.H. Stalling, who holds that Darky's journey explicitly symbolizes the desire to make room for indeterminate blackness in terms of cultural production and personal identity. We find in this novel, Slumberland, music, beat, and breaks in sampling became metaphors for understanding blackness and black identity outside US context. Our protagonist Ferguson finds that the hatred of the blacks and Jews is still running under the skin of Berliners, that is Germans, even after 40 years of Nazi era. The way he is welcomed by the owner of the apartment of lodgings is the first evidence of the racist attitude of Germans and cultural shock that Ferguson encounters on the very first day he arrives in Berlin. The landlord refuses to shake hands with him, he being a black man. Over time, the friendly small talks with the newspaper vendors develop into such talks like, "Oh wow, I can't believe you have been here 3 months already. Where are you going back to Germany?" So such kind of talks go on, which hint and which remind him of his origin, and which remind him that he is an outsider and he is an unacceptable kind of being in Berlin, in Germany. So such an unacceptance from the Berliners become a hard film for the protagonist to digest. He feels annihilated, rootless, and dispatched. In his bar and on many other spots also, he meets several other Berliners who some of the times offer him drinks, but at the same time they also make him feel being patronized, and they begin to talk about black slaves, how black slaves have survived by improvising and creating jazz music, and how everything coming from blacks has declined into negroidery. This is the word. This is a very you may say this is kind of racial slur, negroidery. This is the word they use. So every black opportunity has declined into negroidery. Such kind of comments are made upon him and all the achievements of the blacks. So and in this way, at every step, he faces one thing or other which reminds him time and again about his origin as an African. Then Ferguson tries to settle down in Berlin and accepts a part-time job of a jukebox sommelier in a bar called Slumberland. The title of the novel has been taken from this bar, the Slumberland. It is the name of his bar where he works as a DJ, as a jukebox sommelier. And on the very first day when he shows up in the bar, he has to encounter with racial hatred. A white German kid is seen by Ferguson writing Ausländer raus in German language on the window panes of the bar Slumberland. Now, what does that phrase Ausländer raus means? It means in English, foreigners out. It is not surprising to see how a small German boy may show a xenophobic aversion towards non-whites and Jews, if one takes into account the Nazi history of his children army of Hitler. But it is quite astounding to see how such a racial hatred is imbibed and cultivated on the minds of even the school children in supposedly developed country like Germany. Even after 50 years of the end of Nazism, Germany couldn't erase this blot of racism from its character and social life, and couldn't teach its children even to act human with the ethnic strangers and to accept differences. Then the sentiment of being an outsider and ethnically unwanted black in the foreign land persistently haunts the heart and mind of Ferguson. Incident at Slumberland Bar, that of the German boy writing Auslander Raus, that is foreigners out on window panes, had already scratched over his made so many scratches over his notions of self-importance, his identity as human being, and his place in the xenophobic world. This is the reason that he comes out to stroll alone on the Berlin street one afternoon. He is shocked to see deserted streets, non-existent traffic, and he becomes to imagine as if he has landed right into the middle of an alien invasion where 50-foot tall robot is destroying everything. But then he also sees in his imagination that a dowager comes out from somewhere, sits just beside the sits on the next swing just beside him, and she begins to complain about the black person who has come there and who has who occupied the swing beside her. So the traumatic fear that has gripped Ferguson's heart comes out in form of satiric imagination in this way here, featuring a racist woman, a dowager, whom the alien invasion is more acceptable and hazardous and unhazardous, than the presence of a black man in her neighborhood. The dowager in this scene will not complain about 50-foot tall, one-eyed, iridescent green robot who is destroying everything, but about the nigger in the sense black man she finds on the swing beside her. This is the bitterest example of the inside burning hatred and racial apartheid of the Germans, in the hearts of the Germans. Now, to be exact, the traumatic fear felt by Ferguson that any white woman may come from nowhere and lodge a complaint against him for any unimaginable excuse is not unnecessary and far-fetched. Neither is it merely his imagined white phobia. It is a concrete fear as that of the thousands of the black men who were arrested on fake charges lodged against them by the whites and persecuted maliciously. The black community has this fear ingrained in their subconscious as they have a long history of such experiences. Then the story of the novel revolves around the Berlin Wall. We all know about the Berlin Wall, how it was fallen down in 80s. The story revolves around the Berlin Wall and aftermath of the fall of it. Paul Beatty is of the opinion that the Berlin Wall fell for the good, but the vision of reunification of the East and West Germany is unrealistic and unfeasible because he thinks Germany after the wall was no better than the Reconstruction era of Germany. Now, I will tell you something about Reconstruction era also and how the reunification in Germany, the period after the fall of the German wall is known as reunification, because there was unification of East Germany and West Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I will tell you something about how the Reconstruction era of America is not was very much similar. Let me correct myself. How the German reunification period is not very much different from the Reconstruction era of America. Beatty states in his novel that the failing of the novel reminded him of the Reconstruction period of American history, complete with scalawags, carpetbaggers, lynch mobs, and woefully lynched, as he has himself quoted, himself said in his novel. The Americans believe that the Reconstruction abolished slavery and guaranteed civil rights to the newly freed slaves by enacting 3 new constitutional amendments. However, the truth was far from what was being propagated. by comparing the period after the fall of Berlin Wall in Germany to the reconstruction episode of American history, BT BT is citing a factual example from the American history of what happens when such drastic steps of either reunification or reconstruction are taken without first taking some measures of cultivating and sowing the ideals of equality and fraternity in the soil of the nation. The author also takes a pinch at the rising neo-racism in German government in order to deprive the blacks and Jews from due opportunities. Such policies are framed that outwardly may seem welfare policies, but are actually designed to keep the targeted people, that is the black and Jews, you may say, especially the black ones, in want or to deprive them of opportunities. The author parodies one such policy, which is absurdly thought to be designed to keep the national unity and nationalism intact. The protagonist of the novel tells us how by legislating the policy of spelling reform, spelling reform policy, that it is a parody of the other policies which the real governments in Europe and America, design for depriving black population from the opportunities. It is just a parody. He has used, Paul Beatty has used a policy of spelling reform. So by legislating the policy of spelling reform law in a covert attempt to institute a uniform thought process, the German government endeavored to bring the country together, thinking that the country that spells together stays together. Now, though this is a parodic presentation of the real neo-racist policies and laws against the Africans in general, the inference has been made quite clear that as the black people are very poor in spelling words, they will surely be blamed for their weaknesses, and the black people would definitely fall into inferiority complex. This is how the hegemonic politics works. Then the fear of belonging to African breed and living in the racist Germany has been well articulated by the author through Ferguson. His fear of getting flushed or humiliated anytime, anywhere in Germany is articulated in many other incidents. Many a times when he's traveling by train, he's he's asked to stand up from his seat and take another train. Many a times when he's moving by a car. Okay, I move forward. Beatty also maintains that even the reunification didn't bring any peace for the blacks and Jews in Germany. Rather, it gave a new vigor to the suppressed old racial supremacy. The dream of a new Germany also worsened the racial distinctions. We learn this through the personal observation of Ferguson. Ferguson states that before reunification, no one called me nigger, the pejorative or very insulting kind of word for the blacks, nigger. So no one called me nigger before reunification, he states, to my face, or said Jew as a pejorative. New young boys jump out of parked cars and in a pitiful imitation of the syndicate American cop shows they watch on television, point finger guns at my head and demand that I freeze. So in this way, the use of such racial slurs, racial words like nigger and smoky, some of the times when he went to meet his friend in hospital, the people call him smoky kind of, So such kind of use of racial slurs and pejorative words make the condition of the people, especially the black peoples, even more worse. The use of such slurs and threats is made to castrate the self-esteem and the idea of African identity, as well as to impertinently reinforce everyday and systematic forms of white supremacy via a white racial frame. And then, at last, the ultimate side effect of the rising neo-racism fever and cultural rift in Germany shows up in form of a phobia of everything white and mental imbalance of a black woman. Fatima is the character in this novel. who falls in love with Shwa, and all of them, Shwa, the protagonist, and Fatima, and some other black men and women go to see Russian disco in one of the halls in one of the cities of Germany, but they are barred from the entry. The women are given access to the disco hall, but the black men especially, the Shwa, the protagonist, and others are barred from entry. On the excuse that no black men are allowed. So this incident, Fatima cannot recover from this.
Can you conclude, Dr. Vikas, within a minute?
Hello. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you conclude, because we are already running?
I'm at the last part of the paper, madam. In this way, the ultimate side effect of rising neo-racism and cultural drift has been presented here through the episode of Fatima. The racial divide is given impetus and is on its new peak. This resulted in mutual dispute, leucophobia, that is fear of all things white in Fatima, and the corollary of this shows up in form of suicidal attempt of Fatima. She always wanted to be featureless, hairless, and skinless, because these are the two features that distinguish a black woman from the other ones. But when she burns herself in one of the squares of Berlin city, she charged herself away to the effect that her skin and her hair fly away. Skin and hair fly away in the air. And the irony is that I sum up. I don't go into that. So in this way, stigmatization and stereotypes are the preconditions of every hierarchical and hegemonic society. Without these political apparatuses, no subjugation can take place. So in order to enforce and sustain the dominance over minor groups, the dominant ones resort to stigmatization and stereotyping through the means of scripture, holy scriptures, mythical stories, or connived theories. The problem with stereotypes is that they limit opportunities for specific groups. And in a nutshell, the traumatic experience of the black they encounter with the neo-racist environment of Germany and the crisis of black existence, even in the post-modern era, are some of the areas that should be brought into light of the mainstream coverage, which Paul Beatty successfully does. And I conclude here. I am very much grateful. I thank you all for giving me such a patient hearing. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Vikas. You have given a beautiful, in-depth textual analysis of Paul Beatty's novel, The Slumberland. And since we are running short of time, the house is open now for one or two questions we can take on this paper before we conclude this first technical session. Any questions or observations?
I might have gone a little faster, so questions are arising.
Well, Dr. Vikas, there are no questions because you made everything so explicit and clear. And besides that, this novel can make a very good comparative study with many of Dalit writings and marginalized writings, because there also the issue of neo-racism comes out. It's not, it has moved beyond caste now, as you rightly pointed out, to certain gestures, to certain stigmatization, or sometimes subconsciously using some words, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I don't know if anyone from the organizer is here. Well, before they come or take. the platform, let me thank you sincerely, all the four presenters, because you have given us enough food for thought. From the tribal learning of English language, we moved on to the
On
Gorkha movement, and then to Madam
on
Ramni
behalf of
mentioning
all
of
participants
the
of
ecology
all four
and
participants along
your
include myself
paper on.
of this particular technical session, I would like to extend my vote of thanks towards our chairperson of this session, Vohra madam. She has really given us so patient ear, and she has also provided us her own insights over every part she heard here. Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you.